We're here with Bill Heller, the author of Randy Romero's Remarkable Ride. Bill, tell us if you would, this is your 21st book. Why did you decide to write this book?
Well, I had written a little bit about Randy in a couple horse biographies. There was a series of books called Thoroughbred Legends, and two of them were horses named Go for Juan and Personal Ensign, and Randy had ridden both those horses. So we had talked about the possibility of someday maybe doing his book. And in the summer of 2008, my son and I went out to eat after the races, and I hadn't heard from Randy for months. February 2008, he had to have his kidney removed. It was so enlarged I had to remove a rib with it, and he was in very bad shape. And he walked into the restaurant 6 months later. He looked fantastic, got talking, he told me he's exercising 7 or 8 horses every morning for his buddy Dallas Stewart, who's a top trainer now, but he used to be Randy's valet back in the day in fairgrounds, and went to the barn the next morning, and here he is. He's 50 years old. He does dialysis 3 times a week, 4-hour sessions, and yet he's exercising 7 or 8 horses every morning, and the guy's 50 years old. He has a pure love for horses. He was one of the greatest jockeys of all time, and the adversity that he overcame, going through 25 major surgeries, not including the frightening incident when he was almost burned alive, and he kept coming back and coming back, and he's a remarkable human being.
What do you think it is that separates Randy from other great jockeys?
I think Randy is very unique for a bunch of reasons. One is growing up in Erath, Louisiana. He began riding in races when he was 9 years old. He was riding in the bush tracks and match races, and some of the pictures in the book, you're amazed that here's a 9-year-old kid trying to control a 1,000-pound horse going 40 miles an hour, and he's winning races. So he was riding for a long time. He had his first bad accident when he was 16 at Evangeline Downs. He had to remove his spleen. He punctured his kidney, his lung, and his liver, and he was riding 2 or 3 months later. So how he accomplishes that, I don't know, but I've never met anybody who's paid a higher price to be successful in this very difficult game of horse racing.
Wow, that's very impressive. Now you mentioned a couple of the famous horses. Tell us about those horses and how Randy rode those horses to victory.
Randy rode probably 2 of the most well-known fillies of the last 50 years. The first was Personal Ensign, and she was a brilliant 2-year-old, and she won her first couple races, and then she injured herself, and they weren't even sure if she would ever race again. She came back, and as a 4-year-old, she had never lost a race, and she got up to being 12 for 12, and there hadn't been a major American horse that went undefeated since 1908. And her final race was in the 1988 Breeders' Cup Distaff, which was at Churchill Downs that year, and the horse she had to beat was Winning Colors, who won the Kentucky Derby. She's only the second filly to ever win the Kentucky Derby. And in that race, Personal Ensign was not handling the track well. Winning Colors had about a 4-length lead. Personal Ensign was about 8 lengths back as they turned for home, and it looked absolutely hopeless. There was no way she was going to win. Then she finally starts gaining momentum on the outside. She's starting to close the gap, and they're getting closer and closer to the wire. And with all this of being an undefeated horse, the first in 80 years, she got up and won by a nose. And that race was voted last year as the most exciting Breeders' Cup race of all time. Now, just 2 years later, Randy was on a brilliant 2-year-old filly named Go for Juan. She won the Breeders' Cup Juvenile filly, made her a 2-year-old filly champion, and at 3 she continued to progress till she was thought of as maybe one of the best fillies of all time. And she went into the Breeders' Cup Distaff, the same race Personal Ensign had won 2 years earlier. That year it was at Churchill Downs, this year it was at Belmont. And there was a great mare named Bayakoa who had won this race the year before. And they went head-to-head from about the far turn all the way through the stretch, and it was head-to-head, and Go for Juan was maybe ahead by maybe a half a head, and they were driving furiously, and she took a bad step and snapped her leg in half. And, of course, sent Randy flying. She went, of course, hurtling down to the track, and this was on live TV, and even worse, it was right in front of the grandstand. And this gallant filly, as she was writhing in pain, tried getting up to get to the finish line, and Randy was laying on the track, and he took one look up underneath his arm, and he said, "Oh my God," and put his head back down. And of course, she had to be euthanized to get her out of pain. There was no way she could be saved. Um, but people loved this filly, and she gave everything she had, and for that to happen on national TV probably disgusted a lot of people, and rightfully so. It was a horrible thing, and Randy came back and rode later that day, and it was just with him one injury after another, and he probably didn't help his cause any because he engaged in flipping, which is a nice way of saying regurgitating your food. And it's pretty common in racing. It's one of horse racing's dirty little secrets, but Randy did that for years and years, and it certainly didn't help him. And of course, the worst thing he ever endured was he was in a sweat box before the races started at Oaklawn Park in Arkansas, and he was in the sweat box, and he reached back over his arm to brush off a little sweat, and the light bulb, excuse me, the light bulb burst, and it set rubbing alcohol on his body ablaze. It was really, really bad. He had burns over 60% of his body, and his chances of surviving were compromised by the fact that he had his spleen removed, and they gave him a 40% chance of living. And he came back and he won a race in 3.5 months. And then 6 months after that, he set a record that still stands. He won 181 races in a single meet at the fairgrounds in New Orleans, where he lives now. Less than a year after he suffered this ghastly, unbelievably painful injury. And he did that over and over and over again.
Wow, that's very, very impressive. Now, this last weekend, you and Randy had the launch of the new book, Randy Romero's Remarkable Ride, at the New Orleans Fairgrounds. And tell me about that. How was that book launch?
That was tremendous. It was supposed to start at 12. People were lined up at 11:45 to buy the books. And it was very important to me that Randy enjoy this day because a bunch of fans came up. He hadn't seen them in a long time. Trainers he hadn't seen in a long time. One guy came up with a program from the 1984 Louisiana Derby, which Randy won on a horse trained by his older brother Gerald, who still trains horses, named Dixieland Heat. He had saved the program from that day, and he wanted to get Randy to sign it. So he touched a lot of people, especially in New Orleans, and he continues to do